November 2025. Niger just sold over 1,000 tons of uranium to Russia. Uranium that powered Paris for 50 years. Uranium that France legally owned, protected by international courts, backed by decades of contracts. Gone. In one move, Colonel Chiani didn't just break a deal. He rewrote the rules. France is threatening legal war. Russia is smiling. And across the Sahel, 3 military governments are watching, wondering if they can do the same with gold, with oil, with everything the West thought was locked down forever. This isn't just about uranium. This is about whether contracts signed under colonialism still mean anything when a government decides they don't. What you're about to see isn't a trade dispute. It's the blueprint for how Africa takes back control. In November 2025, Niger did something no former French colony had dared to do in decades. Colonel Abdurah Hamman Chiani's military government sold over 1,000 tons of uranium to Russia. Uranium that had been extracted by France's state-backed mining giant, Orano. Uranium that Paris considered its own. The transaction wasn't just completed, it was irreversible. And with it, one of the last pillars of Francafrique came crashing down. This wasn't a rogue sale. It was a calculated severance. For over 50 years, France had maintained a stranglehold on Niger's uranium sector, feeding its nuclear reactors, while Niger remained one of the poorest nations on Earth. Orano, formerly known as Areva, operated mines that powered French cities, but left behind radioactive tailings, contaminated water sources, and communities with rising cancer rates. The wealth flowed north. The damage stayed behind. When the junta came to power in 2023, they inherited a country still bound by colonial-era contracts. Contracts that gave France priority access to Niger's resources at prices locked in decades ago. Contracts that made sovereignty a legal fiction. So Chiani's government did what diplomacy couldn't. It seized control. And when Orano protested, citing international arbitration rulings in its favor, Niamey's response was blunt. This uranium is compensation for extraction without fair payment, for environmental destruction, for economic suffocation. The courts can rule all they want. The uranium is gone. Moscow didn't hesitate. Russia's state nuclear agency, Rosatom, has been expanding across Africa for years, and this deal fits perfectly into a broader strategy. It's not just about uranium. It's about influence. Every ton that leaves Niamey for Russia is a ton that doesn't go to France. Every deal signed with Moscow is a signal to Paris that the old rules no longer apply. And for Niger, it's proof that there are alternatives to Western dependency. France, predictably, exploded. Accusations of theft, legal threats, claims of Russian collusion destabilizing the region. But here's the reality. Niger no longer cares what Paris thinks. The country has spent the last 2 years systematically dismantling French presence. Military bases closed, troops expelled, mining rights revoked. This uranium sale is the culmination of that process, not an isolated provocation. And it sends a message far beyond Niamey. Across the Sahel, other nations are watching. Mali and Burkina Faso, both led by military governments that have also expelled French forces, are now formalized allies of Niger under the newly formed Alliance of Sahel States. The AES isn't just a defense pact. It's an economic and political bloc designed to break the cycle of external control. If Niger can reclaim its uranium, what's stopping Mali from renegotiating gold contracts? What's stopping Burkina Faso from revisiting cotton trade agreements that have kept farmers impoverished for generations? This is where the stakes become clear. France has built its post-colonial power on resource access. Uranium from Niger, gold from Mali, cocoa from Ivory Coast, oil from Gabon. These weren't just trade deals. They were the infrastructure of French geopolitical relevance. Lose Niger's uranium, and you're not just losing a contract. You're losing leverage. You're losing the ability to sustain your nuclear energy independence without alternatives that cost more and come with fewer strings attached. And Russia knows this. Moscow isn't interested in replacing French exploitation with its own, at least not publicly. What it offers is something more valuable to juntas under Western sanctions: political cover, military support, and a willingness to deal without lecturing about democracy. That's why this uranium sale matters. It's not just commerce, it's realignment. What happens next could redefine the region. If Niger's move goes unanswered, if France cannot reverse this through legal or economic pressure, then the floodgates open. Other nations will test the limits. Other resources will be renegotiated. The Sahel could become the testing ground for a new model of sovereignty, one built not on Western institutions, but on raw assertion of national interest backed by alternative powers willing to engage on different terms. France is losing Africa, not because of military defeat, not because of democratic backsliding, but because the cost of maintaining control has finally outweighed the fear of letting go. And for Niger, this uranium sale isn't just a transaction. It's a declaration. The era of extraction without consequence is over. Colonel Abdurah Hamman Chiani just did what decades of African leaders couldn't. He took France's uranium and sold it to Moscow. Over 1,000 tons. Gone. And there's nothing Paris can do to get it back. This isn't a diplomatic spat. It's a rupture. In late 2025, Niger's military government finalized the sale of uranium stockpiles to Russia. Uranium that had been mined under contracts with Orano, France's state-linked nuclear giant. The French government immediately cried foul, invoking international arbitration rulings, accusing Niamey of theft, claiming breach of contract. But Niger's position was clear. This isn't theft. This is payment. For decades of extraction, environmental devastation, and economic subjugation, the uranium left Niger's borders, and with it, the last illusion that France still controlled the Sahel. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what uranium means to France. It's not just an energy resource. It's the foundation of French nuclear independence. Roughly a third of the uranium that has powered France's reactors over the past 50 years came from Niger. And yet, Niger itself remains one of the least electrified countries on the planet. The lights stayed on in Paris, while villages around the mining town of Arlit dealt with contaminated groundwater and spiking cancer rates. The wealth was extracted. The costs were left behind. When Chiani's junta seized power in 2023, they inherited a country still shackled by colonial-era agreements. Agreements that locked Niger into selling uranium at below-market rates. Agreements that gave France priority access regardless of global price shifts. For years, Nigerian officials had tried to renegotiate. They were ignored. So the junta stopped asking. They revoked Orano's operating licenses. They expelled French troops. And when international courts ruled in favor of the French company, Niamey's response was defiant. Your courts don't govern our sovereignty. Russia saw an opening. Rosatom, Moscow's state nuclear corporation, has been quietly expanding its footprint across Africa for years. It offers what the West often doesn't. Deals with no democracy clauses, no lectures about governance, no conditions tied to IMF reforms. Just business. And for a military government facing Western sanctions and diplomatic isolation, that's exactly what's needed. The uranium sale to Russia wasn't just a transaction. It was a geopolitical pivot. Every ton that goes to Moscow is a ton France doesn't get. Every contract signed with Rosatom is a signal that alternatives exist. But this move reverberates far beyond Niger's borders. The Alliance of Sahel States, formed by Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, is watching closely. All three nations have expelled French forces in the past 2 years. All three are led by military governments skeptical of Western influence. And all three are resource-rich, but economically constrained by decades-old contracts that favor European companies. If Niger can unilaterally seize control of its uranium and sell it elsewhere, what's stopping Mali from doing the same with gold? What's stopping Burkina Faso from revisiting its mining agreements? This is where the stakes become clear. France has built its post-colonial influence on resource dependency. Uranium from Niger, gold from Mali, cocoa from Ivory Coast. These weren't partnerships. They were structures of control. Lose access to Niger's uranium, and France doesn't just lose a supplier. It loses leverage. It loses the ability to sustain energy independence without paying market rates to alternative sources. And for a country that has long prided itself on strategic autonomy, that's a seismic shift. What happens next could redefine the region. If France cannot reverse this sale through legal or economic pressure, if Niamey's defiance stands without consequences, then the model spreads. Other nations will test the boundaries. Other resources will be renegotiated. The Sahel could become the proving ground for a new kind of sovereignty, one that doesn't wait for Western approval, one that leverages competition between global powers to break free from old hierarchies. And Russia is betting on exactly that. Moscow doesn't need to occupy Africa. It just needs to be the alternative when the West says no. Every French base closed, every contract revoked, every uranium shipment redirected. It's not Russian expansion. It's French contraction. And for Niger, this sale isn't just about money. It's about proving that the era of extraction without agency is over. France is losing the Sahel, not on a battlefield, not through revolution, but through the cold, calculated assertion of national interest by governments that have finally decided the cost of defiance is lower than the cost of compliance. Niger just sold over 1,000 tons of uranium to Russia. Uranium that France considered theirs. The sale is done. The money has changed hands, and Paris can't stop it. November 2025 marks the moment the Sahel's break from France became irreversible. Colonel Abdurah Hamman Chiani's government didn't just revoke mining licenses or expel troops. They liquidated stockpiles. Over 1,000 tons of uranium extracted by the French nuclear company Orano were sold directly to Moscow. France invoked international law, pointed to World Bank arbitration rulings that sided with Orano, threatened legal consequences. None of it mattered. Niger's response was surgical. This uranium isn't stolen. It's compensation for decades of exploitation, for environmental destruction, for wealth that flowed out while poverty stayed behind. The transaction is complete, and no court ruling will reverse it. This is what the end of Francafrique looks like. Not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet, methodical dismantling. For over 50 years, Orano and its predecessor Areva operated uranium mines in northern Niger, feeding France's nuclear reactors, while Niger remained trapped in energy poverty. The numbers tell the story. France derived roughly a third of its nuclear fuel from Nigerian soil, powering millions of homes, sustaining its status as a nuclear-independent nation. Meanwhile, around the mining hub of Arlit, communities dealt with contaminated water sources, abandoned tailings, and health crises that were never adequately addressed. The contracts that governed this extraction were signed in the 1970s, locking Niger into below-market pricing and guaranteeing French priority access, regardless of global uranium demand. It wasn't partnership. It was structural dependency. When Chiani's junta took power in 2023, they inherited not just a country, but a system designed to keep Niger economically subordinate. Renegotiation had been attempted before by previous governments, with little success. So the military government stopped negotiating. They revoked Orano's licenses. They shut down operations. And when the company took Niger to international arbitration, the junta made a calculated decision. Ignore the ruling. Treat the uranium as reparations. Sell it to whoever offers the best terms. Russia did. Moscow's entry into this equation isn't accidental. Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear corporation, has been expanding aggressively across Africa, positioning itself as the alternative to Western energy dominance. For Niger, facing sanctions and diplomatic isolation after the coup, Russia offers something Europe won't: unconditional engagement. No democracy clauses. No governance benchmarks tied to IMF loans. Just pragmatic deals with immediate economic returns. The uranium sale to Russia is more than a contract. It's a realignment. Every ton that leaves for Moscow is a ton France loses access to. Every agreement signed with Rosatom weakens the leverage Paris once held. But the implications stretch far beyond Niger. The Alliance of Sahel States, a newly formalized bloc comprising Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, is built on a shared rejection of French military and economic presence. All three nations have expelled French troops. All three are led by military governments that came to power through coups. And all three are resource-rich, but locked into colonial-era trade structures that favor European extraction over local development. If Niger can unilaterally seize uranium stockpiles and redirect them without facing effective international consequences, what precedent does that set? Mali has gold. Burkina Faso has minerals. Both have watched this uranium sale closely. This is where the stakes become clear. France's influence in Africa has always relied on institutional inertia. Contracts signed decades ago, treaties that outlasted the regimes that signed them, arbitration mechanisms that favor corporations over sovereignty claims. But Niger just proved those mechanisms are only as strong as a government's willingness to comply. And increasingly, Sahelian governments aren't willing. They've calculated that the cost of defiance, sanctions, legal battles, diplomatic isolation is lower than the cost of continued subordination. What happens next could reshape the continent. If France cannot reverse this sale through legal pressure, if Niger's defiance stands without material consequences, then the model spreads. Other nations will test the limits. Other resources will be renegotiated. And the infrastructure of post-colonial control, built on predictable access to African commodities at favorable terms, begins to erode. Russia doesn't need to dominate the Sahel. It just needs to be there when France isn't. Every base closed, every contract revoked, every uranium shipment redirected. It's not Russian expansion. It's French retreat. And for Niger, this sale isn't just economic. It's a declaration. The era of extraction without consent is over. The question now is whether the rest of Africa is watching closely enough to follow. Late 2025. Niger sells uranium to Russia. Not just any uranium. Stockpiles extracted by France's Orano. Over 1,000 tons. The transaction is final. And France can't reverse it. This isn't a negotiation gone wrong. It's a severance. Colonel Abdurah Hamman Chiani's military government took uranium that had been mined under decades-old French contracts and sold it directly to Moscow. Paris erupted. Legal teams mobilized. Accusations of theft, breach of contract, collusion with Russia. International courts were invoked, arbitration rulings cited. None of it mattered. The uranium had already left Nigerian territory. The money had changed hands. And Niamey's justification was unapologetic. This isn't theft. It's reparations. For 50 years of extraction that enriched France, while leaving Niger contaminated, impoverished, and dependent. To grasp why this move carries such weight, you need to understand what uranium has meant to both countries. For France, Niger's uranium wasn't just a commodity. It was strategic infrastructure. Roughly a third of the fuel powering French nuclear reactors came from Nigerian mines, sustaining France's energy independence and its position as a nuclear power. For Niger, those same mines represented environmental devastation and economic exploitation. Around Arlit, the heart of uranium production, communities live with radioactive waste, polluted groundwater, and health crises that were never adequately addressed. The contracts governing extraction were signed in the 1970s, locking Niger into selling uranium at below market rates with guaranteed French priority access. It was extraction without reciprocity. Wealth flowed north. The damage stayed behind. When Chiani came to power in 2023, his government inherited a system designed to perpetuate dependency. Previous administrations had attempted renegotiation. They were stonewalled. So the junta stopped asking permission. They revoked Orano's operating licenses. They expelled French military forces. And when Orano took Niger to international arbitration and won, the government made a calculated decision. Ignore the ruling. Seize the stockpiles. Sell them to Russia. Treat it as compensation for decades of uncalculated harm. Russia's role here is deliberate. Rosatom, Moscow's state-controlled nuclear corporation, has been systematically expanding across Africa, positioning itself as the alternative when Western powers impose conditions. For Niger, facing sanctions and diplomatic isolation after the coup, Russia offers something the West won't: engagement without governance prerequisites, no democracy benchmarks, no structural adjustment programs, just straightforward transactional relationships with immediate economic returns. The uranium sale to Russia isn't just commerce. It's a geopolitical realignment. Every ton that goes to Moscow is a ton France loses. Every contract signed with Rosatom erodes the leverage Paris once wielded. But the shockwaves extend far beyond bilateral relations. The Alliance of Sahel States, formalized by Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, is built on a shared rejection of French influence. All three nations have expelled French troops in recent years. All three are led by military governments that seized power through coups. And all three are resource-rich, but constrained by colonial-era agreements that favor European companies over national development. If Niger can unilaterally take control of uranium stockpiles and redirect them without facing effective international consequences, what message does that send? Mali has gold. Burkina Faso has significant mineral reserves. Both are watching. This is where the stakes become clear. France's post-colonial influence in Africa has always relied on institutional mechanisms: arbitration courts, long-term contracts, treaties that outlasted the governments that signed them. These structures created predictable access to resources at favorable terms. But Niger just demonstrated that those mechanisms only function when governments choose to comply. And increasingly, Sahelian governments are choosing defiance. They've calculated that the cost of breaking with France, sanctions, legal battles, diplomatic isolation, is lower than the cost of continued subordination. What happens next could redefine the continent's power dynamics. If France cannot reverse this uranium sale through legal or economic pressure, if Niger's defiance stands without material consequences, then the precedent is set. Other nations will test the boundaries. Other resources will be renegotiated. The infrastructure of post-colonial control, built on guaranteed access to African commodities, begins to fracture. Russia doesn't need to replace French dominance. It just needs to be present when France isn't. Every expelled base, every revoked contract, every redirected shipment, it's not Russian expansion. It's French contraction. For Niger, this uranium sale is more than an economic transaction. It's a declaration of autonomy, a rejection of the idea that sovereignty can be overridden by contracts signed under unequal conditions. The era of extraction without consent is over. The question now is whether the rest of Africa recognizes this moment for what it is, not an isolated act of defiance, but a template for reclaiming control.